this is a strategy that you may have not have ever heard of, and it's kind of cool. I call it add a buyer. This will work with a bank seller. Now, with an individual seller, you don't need to do this because you can do an assignment. But with a bank seller, you can't do the assignment. You might rather not, because it can be costly because of the 2 sets of closing costs, which we've already addressed. So let me tell you how this came about. I had a house under contract. It was in Stuart, Florida. This was years ago. I was brand new to wholesaling. It was a Fannie or Freddie property. I can't remember which. And this was in the, I don't know, 95, 94, something like that. 95. And I got it under contract. I floated it out to my buyers, my rehabber buyers, and one of them was willing to give me $2,000 more than what I had agreed to pay. So before we go on, let's dwell on that for a second. The buyer was willing to give me $2,000 more than what I had agreed to pay the seller. What was the mistake I made? I paid too much. I paid too much. And it was a bank, you know, Fannie Freddie property, so an assignment was out. Even back then, they didn't allow assignments. And so I was kind of stressed out because I wanted to make money on the deal, but I knew if I had a double closing, that $2,000 would turn into no thousand, something, you know, something awful. So I was, you know, I was sitting awake one night. I was thinking, there's got to be a way. There's got to be a solution. There's got to be a solution. And then I remembered that it was not uncommon at the time for the closing agent to want me to add my wife to the agreement. They'd say, well, here in Florida, it's a spousal state or whatever. You know, your spouse has to sign too. And they do it sometimes and not others, which I never understood. And the way we did it was we would add her as a buyer with an addendum. And the seller would agree that we were adding a buyer, and I would agree that we were adding a buyer, and the new buyer would agree that they were being added as a buyer. Everybody signs off on the addendum. The addendum says, adding a buyer, adding buyer, you know, whatever, adding my wife or whomever as an additional buyer, signed by the seller, the buyer, and the new buyer. Easy. So I thought, maybe there's a way to do this. So I called my title agent that morning, the following morning. Her name was Danya Beagle. And great gal, really good at what she did. And I said, hey, I've got this house under contract. You know about it. You've already done the title work, the preliminary title work. I've got a buyer, but he'll only pay me $2,000 more than what I've, you know, my contract price. It's not assignable. If I do a simultaneous closing, you know, like better than anybody, I'm going to get eaten alive with closing costs. Could we add Ricky Rehabber to the agreement as an additional buyer, and then somehow he pay me the $2,000? I wish it was more, but the $2,000 to go away. And she said, yeah, we can do that. You will add Ricky as an additional buyer. You'll come to closing. You'll close together as tenants in common, and then you'll sign a quit claim deed, not quick, but quit claim deed. You'll quit your claim of ownership of the property over to him in exchange for the $2,000. You can walk away and he'll own the house. There'll only be technically there'll be 2 closings. The quit claim deed is a second closing, but there'll only be one that really incurs any significant closing costs, because the quit claim deed will go through the system as $10 and other valuable consideration. And I thought, okay, perfect. So we're really going to have, we're going to have 2 closings. Technically, it's a simultaneous closing, but there's really only one real set of closing costs. So I went to my buyer and I said, here's what I want to do. I want to add you as a buyer. And I explained it to him as best I could, and he said, okay, that sounds good. I just have one quick question. So if I understand this correctly, we go to the closing and we buy the house as partners, basically, and then after we do that, you sign a quit claim deed in exchange for the $2,000. And I said, exactly. And he said, okay, sounds good, except I just have one question. What if after we've bought the house, signed all the paperwork, and we now technically own it together, what if you get up to go to the men's room and don't come back? I thought, that's a good question. Not sure how to answer that. Grabbed my cell phone, which was one of those Motorola brick phones back then, I think. And I called Danya. I said, hey, she said, oh, that's simple. Here's what we'll do. We'll close the quit, or we'll execute the quitclaim deed first, and I'll hold that in escrow, which will look an awful lot like a manila folder on the table. And then we'll close the other transaction after, so there's no way for you to get up and run out of the room and, without quit claiming your interest. So I explained that to my Ricky Rehabber buyer, and he said, let's do it. And so that's what we did. And I walked away with $2,000. Now, the beauty part of that was I had effectively avoided the typical cost of a simultaneous closing where you're buying for $200, selling for $220. Closing costs associated with two $200,000+ transactions are a lot more expensive than closing costs on one $200,000 transaction and one quitclaim deed at $10 and other valuable consideration. And even in the worst case scenario, if the closing says, no, we're putting the quitclaim deed through at the 20 grand, that's what you're being paid for this. The closing costs on the 20 grand you're being paid for the quitclaim deed are going to be a whole lot lower than the closing costs on a $220,000 sale. Does that make sense? That there is a way to kind of work the system a little bit. It is in effect a simultaneous closing, but it's a great way to avoid the closing costs. Now the downside is your buyer's going to know exactly how much you're making because they're going to pay you to go away like an assignment. So if you are buying it for $200 and selling it for $650, which happens when you swing at the ball, you occasionally put it in the parking lot. You might not want your buyer to know you're making that much. And in that case, you might say, well, I could add a buyer, but I think I'll just stick to the simultaneous because that way my buyer doesn't know what I'm making. They could always look later, but at least they'll have to look after I get my $400,000 check. Because even the most easy to work with buyers can sometimes get a little flipped out if they know you're making huge money on the deal. And the simultaneous closing is anonymous by nature until afterward where everything's a matter of public record. And if your buyer's that curious, look, so what? Who cares? So adding a buyer is a really, really good way to kind of create a hybrid that's somewhere in between an assignment and a simultaneous closing.